More on this and some of the other top business stories of the day as Doug Flynn joins us, co-founder of Flynn Capital Management and a certified financial planner. And the student loans, Doug, have been a big story this week, as I say, because people had to start paying them again. And now the president, I guess, is starting to, or trying to forgive some of this. How do you look at this as an issue for not only the people dealing with it, but for the economy?
I mean, there's some things to like in that for people that make their payments on time. The reward, what you don't want is a success penalty. So a reward for paying it on time and some first responders and things you mentioned, I think are good things. I think what it really comes down to is the administration is going to do everything it can to keep the cash flow at the individual level so that people keep spending. They want to avoid a recession at all costs, especially as you're coming into the full-fledged election season. So if we go into a recession, they're going to hang that on him. And this is just going to keep the money flowing and hopefully people keep spending because so far the consumer's been pretty good at that.
Yeah. A couple of other things today that are out there, markets in the business world. One's jobs report on private sector jobs, which we get from ADP, and that was not great. I mean, 89,000 was the number in terms of for the month of September, but that's down from August at 180,000. So what are we to make of this, private sector jobs?
So a couple of things. What the ADP report is showing is that perhaps the labor market is getting a little worse. That directly conflicts with what was just coming out 2 days ago, but the official government report will come out on Friday, which is the one we really want to look at. Personally, right, as I've analyzed the ADP report, it's very erratic and it's not consistent, and I don't really rely on that as much as I would on some of the other indicators out there. I don't like to put all my emphasis on the government reports, but the one that's coming out on Friday will be a much better measure. But mainly because it looked like there were sort of increasing jobs. That's why the bond market and the stock market freaked out the other day. And now it looks like there's going to be decreasing jobs, which means you get closer to perhaps a recession, and then the Fed can stop raising rates and then eventually begin to lower them. That's where we're going.
There's always this back and forth, what's good news for markets or good news for regular people. Speaking of regular people, I was reading on the way in today a couple of things in the Wall Street Journal. One was on mortgage rates, which we've talked about a decent amount because it's a big issue for people who are either looking to buy a home or are thinking about selling their home. But they, this piece basically said, you know what, 8%. That's where we're headed, and that seems like a reasonable number. Is that what's going to happen? Will we hold 8% mortgages for a while? Where do you see rates?
It's very possible. Normally you want to look, if you're shopping for a mortgage, you want to look at the 10-year Treasury yield.
Right.
There's typically about a 2% spread between the Treasury yield and mortgage rates. Right now, it's at 3%. And so it is likely that if you see the 10-year Treasury hit 5%, it almost got there and then it backed off a little bit, that you could, with that current 3% spread, hit 8% on mortgages. And the Fed has said they're going to raise rates again. So it is likely that you touch that before it begins to ease. And that's really the problem, is that if we have a tighter and tighter interest rate where it's costing more and more, whether it's car loans, whether it's mortgages, eventually the economy slows down enough and then the Fed can begin to cut rates, but we're not there yet.
And we know we have older people watching say, oh, I remember rates when they were a lot higher, but there's a whole generation of people that are, basically middle-aged now that have never really dealt with this kind of environment, which makes it very difficult to deal with. Last article, I mentioned there were two articles. The other one that kind of caught my eye that I thought was interesting, they did this thing where they said, if you get a voucher at the airport when you're flying, it just talks about inflation and how high prices are. They said if they give you $100, you'd be like, oh, this is great. But these days, it just doesn't go that far, which got us thinking about that New York Times columnist David Brooks, who had posted on social media about the meal he had at Newark Airport. He got a lot of pushback on this about how it was $78. But it turns out, the burger was like 18, and he was drinking like a fish on the rest of it. He spent the rest on whatever kind of liquor he was having, and later said that, I shouldn't be tweeting about this or anything else, which was kind of funny. But, have you looked into this at all? I see you're in Las Vegas now, so maybe you had a voucher, or how do you look at this one?
Yeah, I didn't have a voucher, but we all take a perfectly good water from home, and just before you go in, throw it in the garbage so you can buy a water on the other side of the entrance at 2 times what you would have paid anywhere else. And that's basically what happened to me. Is I bought some potato chips and some lemonade, and I paid anywhere from 50 to 80% more than I would have paid at the local CVS. And so you kind of know when you go into the airport, you're gonna you're going to get hosed on prices.
Yes.
It's just unfortunate that you can't bring in some of those things that you would have from the outside, because they're supposed to have price controls. 80% of the airports around the country do have some, they call it street pricing regulations, where they're only supposed to be about 10 or 15% more than the local street price. But that is not what I think most people come to have when they actually get to the airport. I certainly didn't.
Looked like LAX was the worst. We just have the numbers up on the screen, which I guess is not a huge surprise. We're not great here in New York either. I hope we don't find out you brought a bottle of tequila there with the water, because, and if you ever tweet out about it, then that's what the real price was. All right, Doug Flynn live in Las Vegas, where he's starting a new residency. It's a one-man show that he has going out there, so we look forward to that as well. Thank you, Doug. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right.
Yeah, that's our kind of certified financial planner.